Maybe just a quick confirmation you're seeing my title slide?
Yep.
Okay, super. Great. Well, again, thanks, Elizabeth, for inviting me to speak to everyone today in the class. I'm really excited to share this topic. So a bit of background on myself. I'm both a conservation biologist and I also work in social justice. So I wouldn't call myself a social scientist, but I'm more and more sort of wearing those hats these days too, like both the conservation biology and social scientist hat. And so I'm thinking about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of conservation. And of course, social justice issues sort of arise naturally from that. And then, of course, I just love maps. And I got my background training originally in GIS, and I just really love how maps tell the story and some of the issues that I'm going to talk about today. I think the message drives home really well when you just see it represented visually through mapping. So I actually teach and do research sort of in these realms, right? So thinking about conservation, thinking about social justice, and using maps as a tool to sort of explore those ideas. So it's not letting me advance my slide. Okay, there we go. So I want to give you a bit of a roadmap of where we're headed. So I want to sort of talk about why I think this matters. So why does social justice in conservation matter? And then give you a bit of background on the history of sort of injustice and exclusion in conservation, talk about environmental justice, and then talk about some solutions. And so first of all, sort of why does this matter? Well, I would say that social justice is really relevant to conservation. So conservation often involves working with diverse human stakeholder communities. And to be able to do that well, you really need cultural competency, right? You really need to have the ability to work across different perspectives and ideas and incorporate different values into how you do conservation. And then, of course, social justice is highly relevant to current national conversations, right? It's in the news every day. This is a currently very relevant topic to all of us. And then also, Indigenous peoples are stewards of the greatest diversity on the planet. So a recent study from the UN found that Indigenous peoples, although they comprise less than 5% of the world's population, are stewards of 80% of our global biodiversity. So again, being able to engage with a broad diversity of communities is really valuable if you care about conservation. And another paper sort of highlights that. So this paper that came out in 2012 looked at the overlap of cultural diversity, where here they're using linguistic diversity, right? The number of endemic languages that are spoken in a given area as sort of a proxy for cultural diversity, because if you have more languages, there's this really nice tight relationship with having more cultural diversity. So they sort of looked at areas that have high linguistic diversity and compared that to our current biological diversity hotspots. And so the map on the right is showing the regions that have higher linguistic diversity, more endemic languages spoken in the dark red, and then sort of these global biodiversity hotspots on the map on the left, and you can see some fairly decent overlap between those areas, right? And then, so in my class, I have students sort of explore this, and so I've just pulled out a few maps here showing that for different taxa. So here we're looking at bird diversity, and again, it's sort of that same map where areas of high linguistic diversity as a proxy for cultural diversity are like in the darker red colors, and here in sort of blue, you're in the little blue polygons, you're seeing areas with the highest bird diversity. So this is the areas of the world that have the highest number of bird species on the planet. And you can see that overlaps really nicely with some of those regions of high linguistic diversity. And if you look at those patterns for mammal diversity, you see something similar. Again, the areas with the higher diversity or the highest diversity of mammals in the world overlap pretty nicely with regions of high linguistic diversity. And again, the same pattern if you look at amphibian diversity, again, higher amphibian diversity, higher linguistic diversity. So again, all this is to say that there's lots of opportunities if you can work with diverse cultures and ideas and values. There's a lot of value to that if you want to conserve the diversity of life on our planet. But we need to back up a bit and think about, now that I've sort of hopefully convinced you why this matters, if you're thinking about conservation, we need to talk about this history of injustice and exclusion that has occurred in conservation. And so the model that we sort of use in conservation of creating protected areas, wilderness areas, and parks pretty much has always been created by banishing indigenous peoples from their homelands, right? So peoples that originally lived on and managed those landscapes for millennia were displaced from the areas that now became our parks and protected areas. And so this model of sort of human-free wilderness was developed right here in the US in the 19th century through the creation of national parks, with the very first national park of Yellowstone National Park. And this model sort of implies that agencies, government agencies, have, and not indigenous peoples, have the appropriate knowledge to manage the environment. But if you think about that, that's somewhat illogical, right? These indigenous communities were living in these landscapes for centuries. And, you know, the places that we sort of, or that colonialists came in and sort of deemed as pristine and worthy of protection, were already, they arose from that management by the indigenous stewards of those landscapes to begin with. So it doesn't seem terribly logical if you think about it, this model of displacing indigenous people to manage these natural spaces effectively. But this model has extended well beyond the US. So most of the world's about 6,000 national parks and 100,000 protected places were created following this model, right? Removing tribal peoples from their homelands. And often the tribes face arrest, torture, or death, even in some cases, for trespassing on their original homelands. And often the sort of real drivers of environmental destruction, like logging and mining, go unaddressed. And this isn't to say that, you know, indigenous peoples, and especially some things like hunting, don't have impacts to the native biodiversity, but often those impacts are exacerbated by logging, often illegal logging and mining and other things. And those aren't often addressed, yet indigenous peoples are displaced to create these protected areas. And so some examples of this, I went to this website that's shown on the bottom here, nativeland.ca. They developed these really incredibly useful maps. I wasn't able to actually get the actual GIS data from them, but if you go to this website, you can look at different areas here in the US, in Canada, and some other countries internationally, and look at the landscape. So for example, if you wanted to do a indigenous land acknowledgement in your talk, you could look up the area that you're giving your talk and find out who the original stewards of that land were. And so the other really nice thing about this website that you can't see in a static map is that these territories overlap. You know, indigenous territories weren't sort of exclusive, right? Like the way a lot of our boundaries are drawn, where, you know, the border of Rocky Mountain National Park ends and maybe some Forest Service land begins or whatever, right? But these territories often overlapped. And so, for example, the area covered by Rocky Mountain, if you sort of go to the interactive map and click on that area, you can see that the original stewards included the Sioux, the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, right? So all these different tribal nations were using and occupying these landscapes, and their territories covered those landscapes. So I encourage you to have a look at this website because it's super useful, especially if you're developing a land acknowledgement. And it's also useful just to explore, again, these parks and who were the original stewards of these landscapes. So again, here's another example from Yosemite Valley, where the Miwok and the Monash and Paiute tribes originally occupied what became Yosemite National Park. And again, it's really useful to explore, well, what happened to the peoples that were originally the stewards of these lands? Often they were displaced to reservations through a whole suite of treaties. And so you can learn about those landscapes and sort of learn about the treaties and the history and what outcomes have happened after Indigenous peoples were displaced. So again, I don't have time to sort of dive into that a lot today, but I just wanted to present this to you to hopefully encourage or inspire you to learn more on this topic. But I want to move on for the sake of time so we can talk about environmental justice. Mostly, again, I'm going to focus on the US and US urban environments, but this definitely extends well beyond the US and well beyond urban environments. So I want to briefly define what I mean when I say environmental justice. So that is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so some important parts of this definition, and this is from the Environmental Protection Agency here in the US. There are other definitions, but I think important in this definition is the idea of fair treatment. Okay, so this means that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences. And then this idea of meaningful involvement, and that means that people can participate in policy decisions that affect their own sort of environment and their own health, and their concerns will be considered in the decision-making process. And decision makers actually need to actively seek the involvement of people that might be impacted. So that's what is meant by meaningful involvement. And the origin of the environmental justice movement came from this statistical fact. People who live or work in America's most polluted environments are commonly people of color and the poor. So communities of color are actually targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts, like landfills or industrial plants. And this concept or this idea is known actually as environmental racism. And so the environmental justice movement was championed by these communities that were often impacted. So African American, Latino, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans. And just to give you a bit, again, I really like maps and how they tell that story in a way that is harder to demonstrate in words. So here, we're looking at Denver on these two maps, okay? So you can sort of see Arvada and Aurora and some of the parts of Denver on these maps. And on the left map, you're looking at the darker blue areas represent regions with the highest percentage of Black populations in Denver. And on the right, you're looking at, again, the dark blue being the census tracts, so the US census tracts that have the highest percentage of Hispanic populations. And this is from 2010, so it's a bit old. But, and then on the red markers, these are areas that are toxic release sites that are in Denver. Okay, and so you can see there's some pretty strong overlap between areas that have a higher percentage of Black and Hispanic communities and these toxic release sites. And so this is just an example to demonstrate this concept I'm getting at of environmental justice or environmental racism. Environmental racism being actually what's demonstrated here, and environmental justice being the movement trying to counteract environmental racism. And so a bit of history on that. I don't have time to go into all of the history, but I want to give you a couple of major benchmarks along the environmental justice movement roadmap. So really the catalyst, or the event that was thought to be the catalyst of the environmental justice movement, was this sit-in that occurred in North Carolina. So a rural, low-income, predominantly Black community in Warren County, North Carolina, was targeted by state lawmakers to host a toxic PCB waste landfill, which has a lot of health impacts. Having PCB waste in your backyard is not good. So of course, Black communities in the area organized a nonviolent sit-in protest against this landfill. And over 500 environmentalists and civil rights activists were arrested during this protest, and the protest did not stop the construction. It actually went, it wasn't dealt with until almost 30 years later. And so that was the catalyst, but it did prompt some studies into this. And so the first of this was the General Accounting Office study. And so this was conducted in 1983, and this study found that 3 out of 4 hazardous waste landfills that they examined were in communities where African Americans comprised over 26% of the population, and whose family incomes were below the poverty level. And then further research was done. So the United Church of Christ conducted, or their Racial Justice Commission conducted a study that looked at the statistical relationships between the location of hazardous waste and the racial or socioeconomic composition of host communities across the nation. And that study found that over 15 million African Americans, 8 million Hispanics, and half of all Asian or Pacific Islanders and Native Americans resided in communities with at least one abandoned or uncontrolled toxic waste site. And that race was the most significant factor, even more so than socioeconomic status or any other variables that they looked at, for predicting whether a toxic waste site would be allocated in an area. And there was a more recent study in 2007 that found even stronger evidence for this. So again, sort of going back to that statement I made earlier that it's very strong statistical demonstration, the evidence all suggests that communities of color are targeted for these toxic and hazardous waste and environmental impacts. And then another sort of element to this story is this history of sort of redlining in US cities. So redlining is this practice where the federal government and lending agencies would actually literally just draw a red line on the map around neighborhoods that they wouldn't invest in. And this was based just on demographics of those neighborhoods. So it wasn't based on anything else, just demographics. So Black inner city neighborhoods were more likely to be redlined. And so Black homeowners were not allowed to buy in non-redlined neighborhoods and couldn't get loans approved for those neighborhoods that were redlined or considered to be risky. And so this has had, even though this practice was outlawed eventually, it certainly had a ripple effect. So today, homes in redline neighborhoods are worth less. They have less value than neighborhoods deemed as best. And of course, home ownership is one of the biggest pathways to upward economic mobility. So if you're not allowed to buy in the good neighborhoods and you can't get a loan in the risky neighborhood, then your path to home ownership is limited. And so a little bit more details on this practice of redlining. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, created these different grades. And so neighborhoods that were deemed best were kind of given this category of A. And these are neighborhoods where mortgage lenders would make maximum loans. Whereas neighborhoods that were deemed B were considered still desirable. And these are neighborhoods where lenders would make loans to around 65% of their appraised value. And then C neighborhoods were considered sort of definitely declining. And the language in these, like the language they used, is very discriminatory. So these neighborhoods were characterized by, I quote, obsolescence and infiltration of a lower grade population. And lenders were much less willing to make loans in these neighborhoods. And then finally, D neighborhoods were characterized, again, I quote, as detrimental influences and having an undesirable population or infiltration of it. And in these areas, it was recommended that lenders refuse to make loans. Again, this is a big problem considering home ownership is one of the biggest paths to upward economic mobility. And so if you want to learn more on that, there's a really great website developed called the Mapping Inequality Project, where you could literally across the US in different cities explore what areas have been redlined and have not. But what I want to dive into, again, I encourage you to look at that because it's eye-opening. But what I want to dive into is sort of this recent work that has come out, so by Chris Schell and some colleagues, where they were really interested in what are the consequences of this for urban environments. So kind of getting back to my realm, right? Environmentalism and conservation. And what they found was that urban environments are very different across wealth gradients and redline districts. So areas that are low income or redlined have more impervious surface cover, right? So more pavement, buildings, things like that. And because of that, they have higher heat islands, they have higher heat loads, they have less green space, less tree cover, more environmental hazards and pollutants, and reduced access to clean water. And on top of that, more invasive species, disease vectors, and diseases. And so just to look at this on some maps, for example, redline neighborhoods have lower green space. So here we're looking at Indianapolis and Baltimore, and we're looking at the NDVI. So this is a vegetation index, and really, if you're not familiar with it, just think about like high means there's more vegetative cover, and low means less vegetative cover. And so the gray areas are sort of this low vegetation, and the green are high vegetation. And so you can sort of see when you look at this, that the areas that have been redlined, right, these red D categories have a lot more gray, right, within those polygons. Whereas those sort of blue and green areas, these sort of better neighborhoods, as the Hulk grades define them, have a lot more green cover, right? And so overall, this is to demonstrate that these redline neighborhoods have lower green space. And this has been found across many cities in the US, not just these two examples. And kind of bringing it to something that's very current and relevant to all of us. This is a concern given that COVID-19 is sort of requiring a lot of us, if we want to go and see our friends, we need to do that outside. That's pretty much the only way we can do that somewhat safely, right? And so if you have limited access to urban green spaces, then your ability to get that much needed social interaction that we all need is limited, right? Or at least to get it in a way that's at least a bit safer than, of course, meeting inside. And so this is absolutely an environmental justice issue. And it was highlighted, of course, in this paper here recently. And then again, sort of thinking about other factors that I mentioned. So I said these redlined areas are often subject to more pollution. And kind of bringing that back to COVID again, it's well documented that communities of color have some of the worst air quality in the US. And exposure to air pollution has been found to be associated with higher COVID-19 death rates. And that was sort of covered in these two papers that I've listed on the bottom here. So again, thinking about how these inequitable practices and inequity in our US cities interacts with the environment and things like COVID-19, you can start to see how all of these issues sort of intersect with each other on a topic that's very relevant to all of us right now. And then something that my lab group is currently interested in is thinking about, so I do a lot of work on acoustic ecology, and sort of part of that is thinking about noise pollution and how noise pollution impacts wildlife and biodiversity. And so we're looking at the distribution of noise and whether noise is equitably distributed across US cities. And probably shouldn't come as much of a surprise to you all after what I've shared with you already, that noise is not equitably distributed across US cities. So here we're looking at the Bay Area. And again, I've sort of included polygons where the red polygons are showing you areas that have been redlined, and the sort of darker parts on this map are areas with higher noise pollution, and the lighter or areas that aren't like dark black have low noise pollution. So again, you can sort of see pretty clearly here that the areas that have been redlined have a lot more noise pollution. And then again, sort of bringing it back to home, the pattern also holds in Denver. It's a little less dramatic, but you can sort of see the I-25 corridor running sort of north to south down somewhat the middle of this map. And again, you have these redlined areas being impacted by more noise pollution, even here in Denver. And so kind of tying this into what we're working on, there's this idea or this concept called the luxury effect. And it's this pattern of higher biodiversity in affluent neighborhoods. And this has been found globally for plant diversity or canopy or vegetative cover. And then also found where there's more vegetative cover, you often have a broader diversity of birds, bats, and other wildlife species. So this luxury effect pattern of having essentially higher biodiversity in more affluent neighborhoods has been found in many cases. And what I'm really interested in, what my lab's really interested in, is understanding sort of what are the impacts of inequitable noise for urban wildlife. So how does this distribution or this inequitable distribution of noise impact urban biodiversity? And especially because there's many well-documented effects of noise pollution on everything from animal reproduction, animal survival, animal behavior, and other aspects of ecology. So that's what we're working on now. Is one of the things that we research is looking at how inequitable noise in cities impacts wildlife. But I don't want to spend too much time on that because I want to make some time to talk about some solutions. So talk about, and on a positive note, and also give you guys time to ask questions about anything I've shared today. So briefly, I want to touch on sort of the opposite of the displacement-based conservation model that I mentioned earlier, and talk about, it goes by many names, and all of these aren't the same thing, but they kind of get at the same idea. So this can be called place-based conservation, biocultural conservation, collaborative conservation, and there's other names too. And again, these aren't all the same thing, but they get at the same idea, and that is having people and conservation-centered protected areas and conservation approaches, right? So it's where the government and conservation organizations work with Indigenous communities to preserve both biodiversity and cultural lifeways. And so I again put some resources down at the bottom for some examples of papers if you're interested in this topic that you can have a look at, including some seminal work by Michael Gavin, who's in our own Human Dimensions of Natural Resources department. And of course, we also have the Center for Collaborative Conservation here at CSU, so that's another great resource if you're interested in this topic. And then another kind of innovative and exciting idea is that many countries are restoring Indigenous place names to their monuments and to their landmarks. And so, for example, some countries that are doing this fairly well are Canada and New Zealand, where they're actually working with Indigenous organizations to restore traditional place names that were replaced by colonialist names. And some really interesting other examples of this is actually a group that started here called Native Outdoors. And so this is a group of Indigenous folks here in kind of the Boulder and Front Range area that are going out and essentially bagging peaks. And as the photo shows, sort of when they get to the top, they do a photo with the Indigenous name of that peak. So here, this is from Long's Peak, right? And so it's this way of sort of through this reinstatement of these traditional Indigenous names, revitalizing that knowledge and culture that was displaced when we replaced these location names with colonialist names. So if you're interested on Instagram, if you follow Native Outdoors, you can see a lot of other examples. And there's some great work also coming out of CU Boulder on this. And I can share that website if you're interested in more details on how they're sort of revitalizing Indigenous place names here locally. And for example, I have my students in my class make maps. So here's Rocky Mountain National Park with some of the peaks there that if you're a climber, you might be familiar with, including Long's Peak, McHenry's Peak, Hallett, Lily Mountain, Thatchtop Mountain, and Estes Cone, all with their Arapaho names designated on the map. Some other really exciting outcomes lately is sort of this cities that are working to fix these legacies of environmental racism. So Denver is one of these cities, and the officials in Denver are working to rectify historical inequities of having more green spaces near white communities and less near communities of color. And they did this, they enacted an environmental tax to fund purchasing land for new parks and repairing playgrounds, creating recreation centers, planting trees in areas that have minimal shade. And so through this, they're correcting decades of these discriminatory municipal planning practices. And that's particularly important as climate change is heating up our American cities, right? And creating, again, another environmental justice issue of disproportionate heat impacts in these marginalized communities. So really cool that Denver's one of the cities taking the lead on this. And then sort of, here's my shameless plug for my class. So if you're interested in these topics, I actually teach a class where we dive into a lot of these topics. Again, this was sort of a brief overview. I didn't have time to dive into any of this in any detail, but hopefully it got you excited about these ideas. And if you're interested, we cover this a lot more in my class that's offered every fall, called Mapping Diverse Perspectives in Conservation. And then finally, another plug, what I'm really excited about is that the Warner College of Natural Resources is about to launch a new minor in diversity and inclusion in the natural resources. And so some colleagues and I, we had the extreme privilege of being able to put this together to develop this new minor. And several of us have worked on courses for this new minor. And I'm really excited to see it launch here in fall. And there will be many courses available so around these topics. So if you're interested, definitely chat with your advisors about that. I'm happy to also answer questions, but there's going to be a lot of courses coming out at this intersection of diversity and inclusion and natural resource conservation. And with that, I think that was all I wanted to share, and I hopefully left enough time for everyone's questions. But thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can see everyone.
Thank you so much. That was great. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, hi Sarah. I have a question in regards to the article that you posted on your screen share in terms of Denver trying to end environmental racism. What are they trying to implement that that helps combat that issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll be honest, I'm not so up to speed on the policy. As I understand it, they're trying to work both on the sort of increasing green space front, right? So like trying to provide more green space in communities of color and communities that have been subject to redlining and these sort of historical discriminatory practices. And then I think from what I recall reading, they're also trying to do it in a way that doesn't lead to sort of this green gentrification, right? Where you just end up having these neighborhoods that become desirable, and then sort of because of that, the house values go up, and the marginalized communities are displaced through not being able to afford housing there. The details beyond that are a bit murky, and I actually tried to look to see if there was a more current news article on this, and I haven't found that information, but yeah, I would love to be able to tell you more. I encourage you to keep following that in the news, as I will.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said. That's more than what that's great, actually. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
great presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, I have a question actually. So you had several maps in there. You were showing NDVI, which for those of you maybe who haven't taken remote sensing, that's just taking satellite imagery and doing some subtraction to get the measure of greenness. But you had another layer of noise pollution, and I was wondering how that layer was created.
Yeah, thanks for that question, because I, again, sort of glazed over a lot of details because I didn't want to take too much time. But so that one was essentially a data set from the US Department of Transportation, where they measured noise from rails, roads, and air traffic. And there's a lot of details in the modeling, but essentially created a raster layer. So I'm not sure if you've covered that, but essentially a raster are these continuous data representations or representation of spatial data across a continuous surface. And so they created the raster of noise in, I believe, 30 by 30 meter pixels, right? So it could be finer than that. But they created a measure of noise. And it was essentially noise that went above 35 decibels, which is like considered safe. So anything above 35 decibels was measured as noise exceedance. And essentially the darker values, as I briefly mentioned, are the, or at least that's the way I drew the map, but the darker values represent the greatest noise exceedance. And so it goes all the way up to, I believe, 120 decibels, which is actually really, really loud. Yeah. And so that's where the data came from. And so I used that data then and just sort of modeled that with the red line, or just overlay that with redlining districts. And we're going to actually bring that into with some other data on biodiversity and wildlife data and try and look at the overlap between those patterns, but we're not quite there yet. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Andrea, you had a question?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Bombaci. I was curious because I do think it's fascinating how certain taxa, like birds and mammals, really thrive in these areas outside of these redline districts, and areas that have historically and currently are where people of color live. And I know that it's still ongoing, the research, but bees in particular have been shown to be one of the few taxa that are thriving in areas where you have more vacant lots and things like that. And so how to kind of, marry the needs of those taxa and those people in those communities, while also, moving toward, greater biodiversity, greater environmental justice as a whole.
Yeah, that's a great question and really great point. And I sort of glazed over that when I talked about the luxury effect. So it's not that pattern doesn't hold in all situations and all contexts. And you highlighted a great example of when it doesn't. So often, like white neighborhoods tend to have these really manicured lawns, right, where that's bad for bee biodiversity, right? And so there are some counter examples of that luxury effect pattern, and it definitely doesn't hold in all contexts. And so I think there is an opportunity to take all of that information, right? So like if we create these green spaces, how can we create them in a way that also sort of brings in native biodiversity, native plant diversity, right? And create green spaces that are favorable for wildlife. By, for example, not just making them all manicured parks. So I think there's a lot of great ways that we can bring in those examples to do better when we're creating these green spaces. And yeah, I mean, I think the other piece of that is like some of the work that I'm doing, I have to like, yes, I'm interested in noise pollution, but I have to think about that extra context, right? Like it's not just about noise, it's also about green space access and how does noise create this added effect beyond, just the lack of vegetation cover, and sort of like is an area that could be usable. So in other words, if you add green space like Denver's doing, so if you like bring green space back, or if you add more green cover to these marginalized neighborhoods, but then sort of don't think about noise pollution, for both people and wildlife, those green spaces may be less valuable if they're still subject to really high noise pollution. So these are like the extra layers of context that we have to sort of bring into the work that we're doing. But that's a really good point, and I really think that's a great counter example with bees, is that, manicured lawns aren't great for bees. These are great questions.
Anyone else? Okay, usually we have more questions, but I think you hit on a lot of different topics. I think you covered a lot. So there we go.
Covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. And so the class that you are teaching, FW 310, that's going to be in the fall. How many credits is it? And what, like, is it geared toward juniors, and do you need a GIS background for it?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, it is 3 credits. And no, you do not need to have a GIS background. So I kind of, yes, you gain GIS skills, but the goal of the course isn't really to have you come in with a lot of preparedness in GIS or to really come away with like a mastery of GIS. You do gain and learn a lot of tools along the way, but really the goal is to, as I said in the beginning, use maps as a way to explore these concepts in a way that you just really can't by reading papers, right? Seeing these pictures, these images on the screen, hopefully like demonstrated what I'm trying to tell you in a way that's much easier to digest and understand and process. And so that's what we do in the class. And so, yeah, you don't need the GIS background, and it's a 300 level class, but it's certainly, when I taught it last semester, I had everything from freshmen to seniors in the class, and they all seem to be successful in the class. So I think it's something that is accessible to anyone. There's a little more work that you'll sort of have to do to get up to speed if you're coming in as a freshman, but certainly it's not inaccessible at that level.
Great, thanks. Andrew, you have another question?
Sorry, I have another question. So I was curious, kind of getting to, because I'm fascinated with acoustics and just the variety of work that occurs with it. And you had mentioned using NDVI as one element that you use, and like your mapping relative to some of the other data. I'm assuming some of the acoustic data that you all collect. Do you all use any like metrics of structure as well, or just focus on, you know, the vegetation productivity side of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, the work that we're doing is sort of this broad brush overview. That is going to be the sort of foundation for more detailed studies that I want to do. So I'm working on some grants to try and do just that. Like, this is the broad brush, national scale. What are these patterns looking like when you map this on a national scale, right? But that doesn't really allow me to do a good job with that vegetation structure component. And I agree, that's really important when you think about how sound attenuates, right? In more structured or like vegetatively complex environments, sound attenuates differently than it does in open environments. And so that's what I hope to do with my future research, is start unpacking some of these patterns with more detailed studies that I can't do with this sort of broad, large scale analysis. So yeah, good question. It's in the future.
All right, Robert, do you have a question?
I was just curious, is your class going to now explore some of the new Esri social justice tools and workflows that they've developed in your class?
Yes, I want to bring those. I just learned about those actually not that long ago. But yeah, so the next iteration of that, a colleague of mine actually was the one that brought those to my attention. I was like, yes, absolutely. I want to bring some of those tools in.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? We're just about out of time anyway, so that works out well. I will remind you that next week, 4 o'clock, will be our last guest speaker for NR 493, and the official title, I had to bring it up, Science in Service to Society, Understanding and Reducing Climate Risks. And it'll be Jen Boner and Olga Wilhelmi from NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research down in Boulder. And they will actually be talking, it's kind of in line with what you were talking about, Sarah, because they have done a lot of work looking at impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities and how it's disproportionately impacting like inner cities and lower income areas. Just climate change and increased temperatures and lack of air conditioning, lack of access to air conditioning. So kind of all the same theme there. So that'll be next week. So with that, I will let you guys go. If anyone has any final questions, we'll stick around for a couple of minutes, but go enjoy your snowy April afternoon. And for those of you in class, I'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
so
It
much,
was
Dr.
delightful speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sarah, sorry, I've got one more question.
Don't be sorry. I'm happy to answer your questions.
So, Elizabeth, you just kind of made me think about it relative to climate change, but even the fires, and you talked about air conditioning and relative to the Cameron Peak fire and everything, and how that's adversely impacting certain communities. Particularly on the Front Range. Is anyone doing work on that right now, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I would imagine the combined, so a lot of folks have done work, and there's a lot of evidence that marginalized communities experience poor air quality. So I imagine that when you combine that with fire and the like poor air quality that comes from having, you know, those horribly dark skies, raining ash like we had last fall. Yeah, I imagine when you combine those two factors, it's exacerbated for communities that already are subject to such poor air quality. But I don't know if folks have done that research. That's just my speculative prediction.
They haven't looked at fires, but they have looked at like asthma and done a lot of children asthma studies and looking at those communities. There's definitely one around the Salton Sea that's come out of that down in Southern California. So there's a lot of folks that are absolutely looking at, hey, how come where you're living is giving you really bad health, you know, in other areas.
Yeah, and just even long-term, drought, like we were just going through the San Luis Valley, and just thinking how horrible the air quality is through there during the summer months in particular in certain parts of that valley, outside of fire even.
Yeah, and how close it is to the reservation, right? You know, you just kind of go a little west and south and there, right? And there's their front door.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I didn't have time and I sort of glazed over is reservations are sort of often you know,
the least desirable land.
Yeah, that, and also like coal plants and industry and all of that is often located within like 50 miles or less of a lot of our reservations in the West. And that's like, again, sort of statistically found to be more often than it should occur by chance. So another example of these environmental justice issues. And again, that's reservations are often subject to some really bad air quality issues because of that. So yeah, there's like, you can go well beyond the stuff that I presented here and find many other examples of environmental justice and environmental racism.
Mm-hmm.
No, when you look at the land use planning that happened, you know, 40s, 50s, 60s, and with major infrastructure like the freeways or railroad tracks, like you talked about, that was probably one of the most interesting studies that come out of the 880, you know, bridge collapse after the earthquakes in San Francisco, was you finally kind of opened up this other side of Oakland, and now, you know, it became, you know, really cool to like live on the other side of what used to be, you know, 880. So it's really kind of impactful when you start to look at how just little pieces of infrastructure, you know, how we've always defined in our language the other side of the tracks, right? As, you know, as a term of good and bad. Yeah, it's really.
Well, I was also curious, like you were talking about your larger analysis with some of your acoustic data and stuff, and taking in, you know, available biodiversity information, right, in addition to vegetation information. And has there been talk about using like NABAT, the NABAT acoustic monitoring data, which is now being done on a nationwide scale as one of those inputs?
Yeah, I'd love to use NABAT data. I don't know if it's there yet. I don't know if they've synthesized that data set yet, or all, because like those are all disparate groups that are like sort of contributing to NABAT.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where they're at with like synthesizing those data. If they were ready, I would love to bring that into this analysis. But yeah, the better like large scale data that you can find are usually with birds.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of good large scale, good temporal and spatial replication data with birds. But NABAT would be such a great example because they designed, the way they designed that's the data collection for that particular study or project was really good. Like it was really well designed and well thought out by a lot of researchers that put a lot of time into thinking about how do we collect data well for this large scale bat monitoring effort. Unlike, you know, I mean, not that the citizen science stuff that's done with birds is bad, it's not, but there's a lot of like caveats to using those data.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't think
actually
it's
go
available
back
yet.
to the data. Like you can go back to the actual recorded bat acoustic data and check and validate or whatever, but
Yeah.
with bird observations, you can't necessarily do that. So
Yeah.
from citizen science. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, I love the question.
Questions, Andrea, that was great.
Yeah, great questions.
Well,
Robert,
take
yeah,
care, guys.
Yeah. Bye.
yeah. Robert,
Be
your
safe,
example.
everyone.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, be safe.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again. And I will share your class in my intro JS class. I'll let them know about it.
Fantastic. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, and drum up some interest.
Super.
So, well, thanks everyone. I'm gonna let you guys go. I will log off and email me if you have any questions, and I'll send you the link to the recording, Sarah, just so you have it in case you want it for yourself.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Sarah. Cheers.
Yep. See ya.